Hey guys, Gretchen Kittleberger here, and it's time for our monthly update. This month we're actually going to go back. I know I said we were going to talk about a different topic, something that we hit the previous month, something we worked on at the International Functional Fitness Federation last month, but I've realized we need to take a step back. We need to talk about what a nonprofit sports governing body is. And why it's different than a commercial entity or a brand or a private company that just runs sporting events. I think that's kind of being misunderstood in our community right now, so I wanted to just hit on that a little bit. I'm going to start with an example. So a really good example of this is the X Games. The X Games, if you didn't know, it is an event for a lot of the kind of extreme sports, things like snowboarding, BMX, skateboarding, and that event was founded and hosted and is run and produced by ESPN. So ESPN is a commercial entity. The interesting thing about this, ESPN's job, you could say, they're a channel, a TV channel, sports broadcaster. Their job is not to run sporting events or develop a sport. Yet they run this event that had a lot to do with the success and growth of some of these sports and has helped develop it in a really positive way. Their reason for doing it, they probably didn't really think like, hey, we really want to grow skateboarding and we really want to help with the development of the rules and make it popular. I think ESPN probably saw maybe a demographic that they were missing, right, in their viewership and maybe some ad revenue on the table and thought this event might be a way to bring that in. However, we've seen through the growth of the X Games and other events, these sports, some of these sports are now in the Olympic Games. Snowboarding's been in for a while, since '98, and skateboarding will make their debut in 2020. But it's important to note, ESPN actually has nothing to do, ESPN and the X Games, have nothing to do with how those sports are run or governed or will be modeled in the Olympic Games, right? In the Olympic movement, all sports federations are nonprofit entities, right? They are governing bodies, and their sole job is to govern the sport, right? That means creating rules, enforcing standards, right? Making sure the athletes' rights are protected, training officials. That stuff is the role of the governing body. Yes, the governing body does have to be aware of and a little bit concerned of with the commercial side of the sport. They do need some revenue to do all those things, to train those officials, to be able to offer prize money to athletes. But the primary role of the governing body is growing and developing their sport, right? When you set up a nonprofit organization, you have to have a charitable purpose, right? And the development and growth of national, international sporting competitions and sporting events, that is an allowable charitable purpose. So when you form a nonprofit, you have the public's trust to fulfill your mission, right? That's kind of how nonprofits work. All that organization needs to focus on is fulfilling their mission. That's the sole reason they exist. When we look at these commercial entities that are running events, they have other things they're worried about, right? In the case of our X Games and the ESPN, they're really doing it to further their channel and the views they get on their TV station and their revenue dollars, things like that. The development of the sport is maybe a secondary concern to them. Whereas when you have a sports governing body, like our organization, right, related to our sport and functional fitness, our goal is purely focused on developing the sport. So that means developing rules, developing standards. The really big thing we want to think about is protection of the athletes' rights, and really integrity of the sport. If you were to say, now this is not to say ESPN is doing those things, I think they're a very good entity, but if we had somebody who maybe didn't have that type of integrity, a commercial entity running events, you could be at risk for things like maybe sponsors are running events, or certain athletes have ties, or agents have ties to events, and then only certain athletes are being selected for events or getting to participate. Or maybe the company doesn't see the value in anti-doping to their bottom line, so they choose to cut that, or they don't want to do a full due process when an athlete fails a drug test, or different things like that, right? You could have companies coming in and not really being concerned about safety, or those are kind of the risks that may come up if you have private entities that are solely controlling and running sporting events, but only caring about their bottom line. When you have a governing body, right, they have to look at all those other things. And particularly in the Olympic movement, right, there are a lot of requirements in terms of things like anti-doping, the way the governing body is structured, right? Within the Olympic movement, these governing bodies are set up as little democracies, so to speak. So one person is not making decisions regarding the sport. What we have in our organization, we have, yes, a kind of executive board that manages and runs things day to day and does make some decisions about the organization. But then we also have our General Assembly, right, which are all the leaders of our national federation. So our members are part of the decision-making process. And, we meet with them all the time and we approach them and talk about what is the vision of the sport, what's the direction we're going to go, and making decisions that align with what they feel the vision should be. All our work is done in committees, right? We have the technical officials committee, programming committee. It's never just one person unilaterally making decisions about the sport. So that's kind of an important aspect of the governing body model as well. But the biggest thing I think to kind of take away and note is that there's a difference, right? Commercial entities, they can run events, right? They can make their own rules for sports. They may choose not to have rules. They may choose not to enforce rules, right? They can kind of do what they want. And there are some great benefits to having commercial entities running events. And then the nonprofit governing body model is actually a little different, right? Because the focus is really on maybe the stuff that doesn't seem as cool on the surface, but is actually really important to the long-term development of the sport. Having rules and standards that are enforced, making sure athletes' rights are protected, right? Training of officials, everything from, we're talking about making sure there's not bias in the sport. Like, okay, we have officials that are going to go to the event. How do we select the correct ones? How do we make sure that maybe athletes from a certain country aren't being judged by judges from that country, right? Technical officials or judges from that country. Those kind of things are important to look at from the governing body perspective. That might not be a priority for a commercial entity, right? So that's the importance of having the governing body, to make sure those values and those things in the sport are protected. The governing body in that nonprofit model also opens up the doors for that Olympic movement, right? Because to be in that movement, you have to have a nonprofit sports governing body. The other thing I think is important to note for the Olympic movement, a sport cannot be a brand or a trademark name or a commercial entity, right? Because they believe and we believe that sports shouldn't be owned by anyone, right? Sports should be open to all. Anyone can go play a sport. So a brand cannot be a sport. A good example of this would be Frisbee, right? Frisbee is a trademark name. It's a brand name. So when we talk about that as a sport, it's not referred to as Frisbee, right? It's disc sports, or sometimes I think I've heard it called ultimate, but the brand name is not used by the governing body, right, to describe the sport, because that is a trademark. Another little known fact going back to snowboarding, right? Originally snowboarding was called snurfing, which is a combination of snow surfing. But there was a guy who owned that trademark. He made the snurf board, and he was very protective of that mark, and he didn't want anyone else to use it. And actually the company Burton came along and like, well, we'll make Burton snowboards and we'll start calling it snowboarding, and we're not going to trademark snowboard. And that became then what the sport was referred to, right? And the sport became snowboarding. Had the snurf board not been a trademark, or had that guy not been as protective of his mark, we might be calling the sport snurfing today. So little known fact, if you want to, you can look that up. That's on the internet. But just kind of to illustrate the idea of that a trademark brand name cannot be a sport, right? Because the belief is that sports cannot be owned by anyone. Anyone can play these sports and use that name, and we want people to have access to that. So I hope that kind of clears it up a little bit, and that it wasn't just talking and saying random things. But I think the important thing to remember is there can be great synergies between commercial entities and brands running event and also the sports governing body. But they both have important roles to play, right? The idea of having really exciting commercial events is great and it's awesome and it helps to grow and popularize the sport. But really the foundation and the integrity of the sport and the longevity of the sport is often protected with that governing body model. And that's really what we aim to look at and aim to do, is really make sure that the sport is protected for the long term and that the athletes' rights are protected. We know there's integrity in the sport and that rules and standards and everything is being applied fairly and equally to everyone.